When I was a brand new patrolman, right around 2005, 2006, the threats that we were seeing out on the street didn't look the same as they looked today. The threats that we most often had out on the street looked an awful lot like this, and an awful lot like this. Relatively low capacity handguns, most in 22, 25. We had some 380s that were out there occasionally, but most of them were very small capacity, very small caliber handguns, and almost all of them were handguns or single, double shot shotguns. Occasionally you'd run into a pump gun, occasionally you'd run into something with a decent amount of capacity, but most of the time this is what you were looking at: single stack, small caliber pistols. It was unusual at that time to run across someone with a 9mm handgun that had 12 or 15 rounds in it. Police officers at that time were a mixed bag. The agency that I started with, we could have essentially anything that was pretty reasonable for people to have handgun-wise. And the most common handguns that were being used at the time were various types of 40 caliber and 45 caliber Glocks. In comparison with what the threat profile was, this made eminent sense for everyone involved. The time of the Wonder 9 had been over for a while. There were various reasons that law enforcement moved to higher caliber instead of higher capacity handguns. You were pretty much at about the same capacity with these as you would have with something like a SIG P226 or a Beretta 92, depending on what magazines you got for them. But with the stock mags, you were getting about the same capacity and a slightly higher caliber. Ammunition technology at the time, as you can tell in my video Why Cops Use 40, that I'll link up there, and hopefully I'll remember to put it down below, was not the best in the world. Old cup and core non-bonded technology, it wasn't the best thing on intermediate barriers, it wasn't the best thing as an anti-personnel round, and it wasn't the best thing for most applications. It did work if you put enough weight behind it and threw it at a high enough velocity. And that was the idea of these higher caliber handguns. And when we were looking at things that you could barely hit the broadside of a barn with and jammed more often than they worked, this was a great thing to have out on the street. And the technology at the time, this was the absolute state of the art. In 2007, Glock quoted at a trade show that I was at that 65% of all police officers in the country were using some variety of Glock handgun, and most of them were 40 caliber. I know that's an amazing thing to think about today, because this is not the cool du jour handgun to be carrying for anyone, but that was the state of the art, the Glock 22, Glock 23. Glock 21s were a close second. Lots of people were using Glock 21s, and most of that I like to think was a holdover from the assault weapons ban era. The concept was if you could only have 10 rounds, you wanted to make them the biggest rounds that you could have, and that, of course, logic and what was popular at the time in gun magazines, which had a huge effect on the way people thought at police departments, leaked into the law enforcement community. And that's not a bad handgun even today, if that's the one that you like using or that's the one that you're issued. I wouldn't throw it away if somebody gave me one, that's for sure. There were some people at this time that were still using Wonder 9s. There were plenty of people who were using Berettas. There were plenty of people who were using P226s or other legacy Sig Sauer products, but one thing that was almost universal about them is they were using a caliber other than 9mm at the time that had fallen out of style and is today coming back, and I think that's for the better. But there was an entirely different group of people on police departments that I want to talk about and is kind of the focus of this video, and those were the people who were using this still in 2008. So why in 2008 were people still using these as police duty weapons? Well, those that were still allowed to because they were grandfathered in had started police work in the 80s and early 90s mostly, and they had lots of trigger time on this gun. The thought at the time was, if I have a lot of trigger time on this and I'm very good with this gun, and this is my opposition here, then what's wrong with it? Why would I upgrade when I'm better with this gun than I am with that gun? And I'll tell you something, that's not a bad argument to make. If you know you're good with something already, why would you switch out to something else to gain numbers on paper when it's the rounds on paper that matter? Can't argue the logic too much from their perspective. Now, looking at it objectively, would they be better off if they had 10 more years in their career, transitioning over, having the more capacity, having the objectively better handgun for fighting than this? Sure, but a lot of these people were thinking at the time that they were going to be out in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. This was good enough for them, and they didn't want to have to buy new equipment, new belts, new holsters, new ammunition, learn new things, learn a new way of reloading, learn a new way of tack loading, learn new ways to use a new gun. Fast forward closer to today, and these started to disappear. These, however, remain in service, oddly enough. There are still people. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at court, and one of the sheriff's deputies at the courthouse that was metal detecting people at the front door was carrying a gun exactly like this. This gun was the very last revolver that was carried as a duty weapon on my police department. I bought it from the guy as he was getting ready to retire. He went and bought a modern semi-auto. I forget which one it was, I'm sorry. But I purchased this for a song, and at the time, they were pretty cheap. They're still in service, though. That sheriff's deputy at the courthouse, still carrying one of those, was still saying the same thing about this gun, and I asked her about it. I said, hey, why do you still carry that? She's like, well, at the courthouse, I don't really need a light because it's always light when I'm working. I don't even carry a flashlight because all I do is this metal detection at the front door. And this gun has served me very, very well. It's a .357. I've only ever shot .38 specials out of it. I took it to a gunsmith after using it for 20 years, and he opened it up and said it looked brand new inside, so why buy something else? And for her purposes, I guess it kind of makes sense. As technology moved on, most of us moved on. This was my first duty weapon. This was a Glock 22. It is now a very, very well-worn Glock 22. It's had lots of street time, so to put it. You can tell one side of it is very scratched up from being used, and the other side of it is pretty clean because it spent most of its time with this edge pointing out and getting scraped up going in and out of crack houses and everywhere else you could imagine. Technology floundered in the law enforcement firearms market for most of my career, and you would think that this would make this a pretty boring video, but recently things have gotten a lot more exciting. See, during this time period, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, the market for weapon lights was getting a lot better. The market for lights and lasers on handguns, the market for handheld lights was very exciting. We went from incandescents and xenon bulbs to LEDs. We went from LEDs that push 250 lumens to LEDs that push thousands of lumens. Today, most people have a weapon light on their handgun. Most of those weapon lights are LEDs. This was the state of the art circa 2010, 2011, 2012. Fairly high lumen light for the time with a laser on it, because at the time that was the most reliable way to get secondary sighting. Night sights, steel night sights, and a .40 caliber handgun with an extended length barrel and slide. The only way at the time you could get more out of a handgun cartridge that was issued by your department was to add a little extra length. Most places weren't allowing 10 millimeter, and the few that were loading it at 40 Smith & Wesson pressures anyway, so you were better off having a 40 Smith & Wesson. Some places straight up didn't allow 9 or 45. This was the caliber of choice, and if you had your choice of handgun, it was any handgun that you wanted as long as it was a .40 caliber Glock. So many people were using Glock 23s and Glock 22s, and a few slightly higher speed people were more into firearms would buy a Glock 35 for the better trigger, slightly longer barrel, and about the same weight. During this time period, the hardest thing about getting one of these guns was getting the holster for it. It was a 6 to 8 week wait for those holsters, but the guns functioned very well. This was my duty weapon for quite a while. We come up to around 2019, and I start to realize that the market has moved on. New ammunition is being issued. Modern, bonded 124 grain 9mm is giving excellent performance. Monolithic copper projectiles are coming out, which bridge the gap between 45 ACP and 9mm. You don't have to like it, but that's the realities of the world that we're living in today. And personally, if I can get the same performance with more rounds in the gun, I'm going to take it if I can. But I started to feel with this more and more like the old man carrying that. I was making excuses for why I was still carrying a .40 caliber pistol with a light and a laser on it. See, in 2019, when I qualified with that, I was the top shot in my department. An old man who had carried a Glock 21 for nearly 30 years, used to be the top shot in the department, coming in with nearly a perfect score every single year. When he retired, that left my slightly less perfect score as the very top shooter. And I said to myself, why would I need to switch out from my old Glock 35 to something new if I was the top shot in the department? And then I came to realize the problem with the original train of thought of people who were using revolvers in 2008. And that is that we are not competing in life against others. We're competing against ourselves. It doesn't matter if I'm a better shooter than everyone in the world with a Glock 35. If I could be even slightly better with something else, I owed it to myself to research what that is and to switch over to it. Luckily, my department still allows a wide variety of firearms. Pretty much anything that I could possibly want that's reasonable, they would allow me to use. And so, the next time I went to SHOT Show, which I am very lucky to be able to do, I went to every major manufacturer of handguns, every single one, and I talked with every single sales rep. And I didn't tell them that I do YouTube videos. I didn't tell them that I have an Instagram or that I run a Facebook or that I have a podcast. I didn't tell them anything other than I was a police officer and I was looking for a new duty handgun. I needed something that was 9mm, that would function well with my department's issued ammo. I needed something that was optics ready. I needed something that was going to be able to have a light on it, one of the newest lights available on the market, and that was going to have a little bit of room to grow for accessories, for optics and lights. So I didn't want to be locked into one optic or one light. I wanted to have as long a barrel as humanly possible to get as much performance as I possibly could out of the ammunition, because I never know who is going to take over the department, who the chief of police is going to be in 3 or 4 more years, and what they're going to decide about what ammunition we get issued. I told them I didn't care how big or heavy or chunky it was, but it had to be 1,000% reliable, and it had to have a good trigger. Because at the end of the day, those are the only two things that are going to help you make hits when you really need them. The rest is almost entirely reliant on your skill set. I went to every booth, and here's what I found. I found that the HK VP9 was reliable and had a good aftermarket service, and it had a good, reliable name, but the trigger wasn't all that great. I found that the Smith & Wesson M&P 2.0s had awesome triggers and had the capacity and were from a good manufacturer, but to get the really, really good triggers, you had to have some special performance center model of it. I went to the Sig Sauer booth, and at Sig, they showed me all sorts of handguns. And most of them, the triggers were okay. But in order to get the very best trigger, the apex of their technology, I had to have some sort of goofy name and gold bits or red bits all over it and look all funky and try to look cool, and that's not what I was looking for. I realized that I had another criteria that I hadn't told anybody about up front, and that is that it had to be a stock police duty pistol. It couldn't be a high performance pistol. It couldn't be a competition pistol. When you look at it, it had to just be a normal gun that was reliable with as good a trigger as humanly possible. I stopped by the Glock booth, and the people there, as usual, are always very nice and very accommodating for law enforcement, but they didn't have anything that was new. They were pushing new pistols mainly for the concealed carry market, and if that's where their money's at, I don't fault them at all. I stopped by Beretta, and I wasn't super excited about anything that they could show me. Their capacity wasn't any better. In fact, in most cases, it was worse, and for whatever reason, I wasn't really excited about their striker fire options. And I didn't want to go to a hammer-fired pistol when I had spent so much time on striker fires during my career. So I went over to the Walther booth, and I looked at the Walther PDP. The PDP is their newest version of a duty pistol. It's not a performance anything crazy, gold-plated competition, anything at all. The capacity was 18 rounds, which is about on par with everyone else. It has room for a light, it has room for optics, there's room for improvement, there's a little bit of modularity built in. One thing that really excited me about it when I picked it up was the trigger on this. Excellent trigger, even without spending the extra money and putting gold-plated doodads on it. What jumped this off the shelf for me is when I went to shoot it on range day and found that when I picked the gun up and just pointed it in like I was aiming iron sights, the dot came right into my field of vision. You see, if you've never used a gun with a dot optic on top, generally speaking, you have to adjust the way you're looking down the sights in order to pick the dot up. Common complaint with people is that you have to reteach yourself how to present the pistol in order to not be searching for the dot when you present your gun. With this, I didn't have that problem right out of the box. Now, when duty holsters became available for it about a year ago, I bought up a Walther PDP. I put a Steiner MPS on it and a Surefire X300. And that combination allows me to have that looking down the iron sights like I do any other gun, and picking the dot up immediately, having a good duty light that allows me a thumbs forward presentation, so I can momentary on the light by just pressing forward a little bit and still keeping both hands firmly on the gun in a good grip. And it allows me to see down that optic, and the Steiner MPS allows me to lock this optic at its brightness level, so I don't have to worry about whether or not my optic is going to be running when I pull it out of my holster. And again, reliability was my primary concern with this project. Now, this isn't sponsored in any way, shape, or form. I bought all of the stuff that you see here, and in fact, everything that you saw on the table so far is mine, and I didn't get any of it for free. I have no business association with Walther, Glock, Beretta, or Sig Sauer, or any of those, but when I look at it objectively, this is what I decided was the best thing that's on the market today. So that begs the question, where are we going in the future? Where are police handguns going 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? Now, I have a prediction that I made to friends a few years ago, and everyone laughed at me, but I'm going to make it again today. I'd like to put it out there publicly so I can say that I said it before anybody else did when it finally comes to pass. And that is that handgun technology in the future, as far as what we can get out of the current technology available in 9, 40, 45, 10 millimeter, all of that, has reached a point where I don't think it's going to get a lot better. I don't think we're going to get much better bullet designs than what we have now. I don't think we're going to get much better straight wall, old style cartridges. Old style, what do you mean? Well, here's what I mean. Metallurgy is getting to the point, and propellants are getting to the point where there's no viable reason why Spitzer cartridges for handguns are that far off from the horizon. We have things out there today. The 5.7 is out there, the 4.6 is out there, 22 TCM is out there on the market. None of them are really picking up and taking off. Instead, we see things like 30 Super Carry that are doing essentially the same thing as 9mm, but giving us slightly more capacity. That's where the money is at. Just like at the Glock booth, the money is at the civilian sector, the consumer market for concealed carry in the United States. When someone realizes that they could get a major contract with law enforcement agencies by making a Spitzer round, something that's 45 to 55 to 60 grains, that gets above 2,300 feet per second, you're going to get performance out of something that's this size that is going to be equivalent with a 223 or a 556. And when we see that happen, it's going to make all of these obsolete. Now, I know that's where the market's going, but the question is, how long will it take to get there? 10 years ago, I would have said in about 10 years. 5 years ago, I said in about 5 years. And now I'm wondering where it's at. Because my most modern duty pistol today is about the same size as a Glock 21 from years of yore. The thickness is about the same, the length is approximately the same, especially if you put a light on it. They're very, very similar sized pistols. And there's no reason with modern technology we can't take something that's the size of a 45 ACP or the size of a 10 millimeter and neck it down and make a Spitzer cartridge and fit it into the same size gun. Now, I'm no engineer, and I don't pretend to play one on the internet, but that's my take on police duty pistols. This is where I'm at today. This is where I started, and this is the last ones that are still out on the road from the previous generations. Where it goes tomorrow is probably dependent on the very people that watch these types of videos on YouTube at 3 o'clock in the morning. Are we so comfortable with 9mm today that we're unwilling to find something better? Hey, thanks for watching Free Field Training on YouTube. And while you're here, why don't you check out some of these other goofy videos that I've made? Or you could subscribe or maybe go over to Patreon and see how you get your name put on the videos like these fine folks over here. All the links are, of course, down in the description. We'll see you guys next time.